At first, Ezekiel's vision from God sounds more like a nightmare rather than a vision of hope. He finds himself transported into a valley of dry bones. As far as his eyes can see, he is surrounded by death. We don't know the cause of that death. What we do know is that the bones are very dry, meaning they've been there for a very long time, ravaged by the hot desert sun and wild desert animals. Not exactly the kind of vision one would hope or expect from God. But it's a reminder that God's prophets not only at times have to deliver cold, hard truth, but also at times prophets have to see with their very own eyes how God sees the brokenness of our human condition. And while staring into this nightmarish scene, Ezekiel hears God ask, "O mortal, can these bones live?" Only you know, God. That brief yet very powerful exchange, echoing the voices of despair and resignation of God's people living in exile. Their collective feelings of being cut off from God and from one another, as their life together no longer centered in the temple. It's a deeply disturbing yet accurate depiction of their feelings of dislocation and of isolation. And God commands Ezekiel to speak to these lifeless bones. And as he does, miraculously, the bones become covered in fresh sinews, adorned with layers of flesh, and covered in newborn baby pink skin. Yet God's new creatures are still not alive, because they're without the breath of life. So God tells Ezekiel to call for the divine breath, the Ruach of God, to come and breathe upon them that they may live. The same divine breath that in the beginning brooded over the watery chaos, giving birth to the universe. The breath of God that breathed upon the dust of the ground, and the first ever human became a living being. The Ruach of God that parted the Red Sea, giving birth to the people of Israel. And it was the same life-giving breath that Jesus breathed upon his disciples as they huddled behind locked doors, that raised them to new life in the Spirit. The breath of God poured out at Pentecost upon all who would believe in the good news of the gospel, giving birth to the Church of Jesus Christ. The Spirit of the living God that dwells in each and every one of us through the precious waters of our baptism, bringing us the newness of life we need through our communion with Christ. The divine breath of God alive and active all throughout God's history with God's people. It was that power that gave life to that valley of dry bones, resurrecting them into a multitude of living human beings. And as God said, they again became the whole house of Israel. And this is our hope as we go through our own times of exile. God is as near to us as our own breath. As we cope with the loss of our familiar ways for finding and meeting God, we are assured of God's presence. And because God is present, we too can breathe and stand together, ready for the future, looking forward in hope. We also have the assurance that as we emerge from our time of separation, our period of dislocation, of being scattered and isolated, that same divine breath will restore, recreate, and maybe even reconcile us into again being the whole house of God. As I said last week, there were those exiles who wanted to foment revolt against their Babylonians' captivity, while others heeded Jeremiah's words to adapt to the new reality in which they found themselves. This past year, each of us has had to make decisions and choices of how we were going to navigate our way through this pandemic. Our leaders strive to do their very best to seek the welfare of all the people around them. Can we now envision that divine breath reconciling us back to God and to one another? Can we envision the divine breath recreating and resurrecting us into being the kind of church, communities, families, even country that God desires us to be? My sermon title came from a favorite quote of mine from Pope Francis, who said, quote, "The Spirit, which is the infinite bond of love, is intimately present at the very heart of the universe, inspiring and bringing new pathways." Can we envision the breath of God infusing us, creating those new pathways of love between us? Yes, we can. If we believe, as we are talking about in this series, that God is unveiling new plans for us to build God's dream house, then we can be certain that those plans will include new pathways connecting us to one another. Like the path between the driveway and our front door, pathways of love create that space of welcome for those to come from outside into this space of God. It's one of the comments I've heard most from newer members, how warmly welcomed they felt by those who greeted them as they entered through those doors. Pathways of love allow us to walk towards someone who is coming from another direction, that we might just meet in the middle and discover how much we have in common, and that there really is room on the path for all. Should we choose to not walk on by or turn around and go back to where we came? Pathways of love enable us to walk alongside someone who needs us to hear their story, providing us with the opportunity to share our faith. Sandy spoke of the many pathways in which we showed our love for one another, even while having to be socially distant from each other, and how we extended that love to the community. And what's so fascinating is a lot of that was on the sidewalks whether it was sitting there at worship and people coming out of their houses to join us, whether it was handing out candy or handing out Valentine cookies, whether it was standing on the market street at the spring fling and talking to so many who stopped at that table wanting to know about Camp Hill Presbyterian Church. Meeting people on the sidewalks, walking alongside people on the pathways of love. Infused with the divine spirit, the infinite bond of love that has the power to resurrect, recreate, reconnect, and reconcile. May we all, as the whole house of God, commit ourselves, our time, our talents, our treasures to fulfilling Jesus' commandment to love one another. That we create strong and durable pathways of love between us and from us into the wider world. Amen.